Howdy, howdy, it's AL-BINO. What are you looking at? You're looking at what was a sugar plant or sugar beet processing plant that was closed in the 1990s in Sterling, Colorado. My dirty ass truck. A lot of dust out here, so we'll take it and get it washed. Why am I showing you this? This is what the Democrats have had in store for you since the 1990s. I'm 2 hours east of Denver, Colorado. 2 miles to my south is Interstate 76. Which links Denver to Interstate 80. Now, most people think, let me fire up my truck. I'll switch over here in a second. Test 1 2. Test 1 2. Can you hear me? Most people think that the Rust Belt is just like upstate New York, Pennsylvania, Ohio, Michigan, Indiana, Illinois. Parts of Kentucky, parts of Missouri, or all of Missouri. Maybe Memphis, maybe Little Rock. Matter of fact, we could include Arkansas and Western Tennessee in what they call the Rust Belt. Parts of Minnesota like Minneapolis, St. Paul, and Duluth. Parts of Iowa like Des Moines. That most people consider that the Rust Belt, right? Northern Kentucky, Louisville area and stuff like that. But in actuality, the Rust Belt extends from Buffalo, New York, across the upper Midwest, through Missouri, through eastern Kansas, through Nebraska, to Denver, Colorado, and then south through Pueblo, Colorado, which is a steel town, through Las Vegas, New Mexico, which used to be a coal and steel town, and Raton and Trinidad, they used to be coal towns. Las Vegas, New Mexico was a railroad town, coal town, steel town. Albuquerque, New Mexico, all the way down to Las Cruces, and then Roswell, New Mexico. Roswell, New Mexico has a lot of food manufacturing there, and every Greyhound bus up until, I want to say 2000-ish, 2003, every Greyhound bus and every city bus manufactured in the United States was manufactured in Roswell, New Mexico. So the Rust Belt states are New Mexico, Colorado, Kansas, Nebraska, Arkansas, Missouri, Western Tennessee, Northern and Western Kentucky, Minnesota, Indiana, Illinois, Wisconsin, Pennsylvania, upstate New York. I say Indiana, Ohio for sure. Those are your Rust Belt states. It's literally a belt across the United States that goes southwest to northeast from New Mexico, and including all of those states in that region. That's your Rust Belt. I could go to Albuquerque in the industrial area in Albuquerque and show you empty factory, empty factory, empty factory after empty factory. There's a food court and a bunch of brand new hotels in a place or in an area of Albuquerque which used to be called the Sawmill District. The Sawmill District in Albuquerque used to be home to Duke City Lumber. What was Duke City Lumber? Outside of the Pacific Northwest, Duke City Lumber was the largest sawmill in the United States. Matter of fact, I think it was the largest sawmill in the United States. And outside of the Pacific Northwest, up until 1993, most of your lumber came out of the mountains of Colorado and New Mexico, and it was processed in Albuquerque up until the 90s. That plant shut down. It used to be, that lumber mill used to generate all kinds of things. 2x4s, OSB, siding, plywood, all kinds of stuff. And it was the largest sawmill in the United States and the second largest lumber producing region in the country. That was closed in the 90s. Lumber that you buy in the store now, a lot of it comes out of Idaho and Washington and Oregon. Yes, it does. But the bulk of the coniferous lumber that you buy now in the store is cut in either Canada, or cut and processed in either Canada or Mexico. A little bit comes out of Louisiana. Very tiny amount comes out of New Mexico, but that comes out of a place that's called Wallatoa, which is on the Jemez Reservation northwest of Albuquerque. They do process a little bit of timber there. But yeah, most of the stuff that you get in the hardware store now comes out of Canada or Mexico. And it's been that way since the 90s. Pueblo, Colorado, there used to be, I think, 4 steel plants there. There's 1. If I were to take you into the industrial areas of Denver or Albuquerque, it would look like a third world wasteland, just like that factory I showed you just now at the beginning of this video. If I were to take you into the industrial areas of El Paso, Texas, which is practically New Mexico, it's like in that little niche where New Mexico, Texas, and Mexico come together. The Sarco mills are closed there. If I take you to the bus factory in Roswell, it's now an empty building near the airport in Roswell, New Mexico. A lot of your buses now are assembled, are a lot of American make or American branded buses are now made in Mexico. Some are made in Windsor, Canada, but most of them are made in Mexico. It's been that way since the 90s. If I were to take you through Roswell, New Mexico right now, outside of the dairy and the cheese plant that is there, and the aircraft scrapyard at the Roswell International Airport, and a few petroleum operations that are still left there. Thank you, Joe Biden, because Roswell was Roswell was also a big oil city too, as was Hobbs and Carlsbad. And Hobbs and Carlsbad are still kind of doing okay, but they're not doing as good as they were 4 years ago. lot of petroleum companies have pulled their operations completely out of Roswell. There's one office in Artesia, New Mexico, and one operating refinery there, and another one north of Tatum. But, you know, that's been curtailed a lot. And New Mexico is the second largest oil producing state behind Texas. It's one of the reasons why Trump was in Albuquerque today. The other reason is because he's actually pulled up close to Kamala Harris in that state. The governor of New Mexico did not want to issue him the permit, but he threatened to sue her in the state of New Mexico, so he got his permit. Had a big rally in Albuquerque today too. But let's go back to the Rust Belt states: New Mexico, Colorado, the states in the Midwest, the states in the Upper South. You know, the manufacturing cities like Memphis and Albuquerque, Denver, and Roswell, New Mexico, and Toledo, Ohio, and Pueblo, Colorado. You know, the Buffalo, New York, Pittsburgh, your manufacturing cities, okay? Where if you were to go into the inner parts of those cities or into the industrial areas of those cities today, you would see what I just showed you in this small town 2 hours east of Denver. Now, you notice I said a lot of this stuff closed down in the 90s. Some of it closed down before that in the 70s and 80s. So a lot of this we can attribute directly to NAFTA, which is why Trump wanted to redo NAFTA and he did Canamex instead. And Joe Biden really hasn't been honoring Canamex because part of Canamex was securing our border with Mexico and Mexico securing its border with Guatemala and Belize. That was part of that agreement. But since we're not following that agreement, and the border policy is part of that, as well as the stuff with the cartels and all that other stuff, right? Canamex was also a not a free trade, but a fair trade agreement with Canada and Mexico. Whereas, yes, Carrier could manufacture some of their air conditioners in Mexico as long as we manufactured air conditioners here. You know, and it was supposed to be a balanced agreement where we would do traffic and we would spread our manufacturing base across all three countries, even proportionate to the population of that country and the resources available and everything else. That was Canamex. NAFTA was a free trade agreement, not a fair trade agreement, a free trade agreement. Understand the difference? Okay. I just left Sterling. I'm on my way back to the house in Julesburg. And oh, by the way, I found a new contract. We're working on that now. So I'm going to leave my video from last week up, and here's why. Because I got lucky within a few days of making that video, and I spent the reason why I was discouraged and tired is I spent that entire weekend desperately chasing a new contract in case the one that I'm on now, and I'm still on it, I'll be on it for another month or so while I get the other one spun up. I was desperately tracing something because I knew that as things are going south with this company that I'm contracted with, that in a month, 2 months, or actually in a week, a month, 2 months, 3 months out, I was looking squarely down at the barrel of, oh shit, nothing. Okay. But this started in the 1970s. And my interest got piqued because I just happened to stumble on the YouTube streets onto a video that was talking about Kissenger and Nixon. Now, Nixon, generally speaking, was a good president, but he had Kissinger as a Secretary of State. And it was one of those deals where, kind of like the first Trump administration, where Nixon was kind of a maverick, and the powers that be permitted him, even though he was elected by a landslide twice, permitted him to operate in Washington, D.C., provided that they had influence on his staff. So here comes Henry Kissinger. August 15th, 1971. Nixon said temporarily, but we've been off of the gold standard as the world's reserve currency. We came off of the gold standard August 15, 1971. It became a fiat currency, and by doing so, every other currency in the world, which is taxed to the dollar, because we're the reserve currency, also became a fiat currency. So what does that mean? That means that not only could we print money as we saw fit, or pull money out of the money supply as we saw fit, all the nations in the world whose currency was tied to the dollar in the SWIFT system could manipulate their currency openly too, because there was no gold standard backing any of the currencies in the world anymore. Remember, August 15th, 1971. Immediately after that, Henry Kissinger started opening dialogue with the premier of China, which at the time was Mao Zedong. Now, we were told at the time that it was because we wanted to pull them economically away from the Soviet sphere of influence, because China was a communist country. And even though they were a communist country, and up until that point within the Soviet sphere, there were divisions between the Chinese and the Russians, and we wanted to take advantage of that. Okay, that's fine. But immediately after August 15, 1971, Kissinger starts flying to Beijing. Behind Nixon's back. Nixon got pissed about this and starts trying to make deals with the Chinese. And Nixon was forced into, through Kissenger and the Washington, D.C. elite, his trip in February of 1972, 6 months later, to formally open relations with China. So you don't think for 1 minute that there were some corporate interests, manufacturing interests, who were lobbying very powerful behind-the-scenes interests in Washington, D.C., who had Kissinger's ear in the Nixon White House to pull us off of the gold standard, and by doing so, every currency in the world, including ours, would become a fiat currency. And that by opening relations with China and formally starting to do business with China, since everybody's on a fiat currency, now the Chinese and other countries who wanted to compete with us and manufacturing could manipulate their currencies to be preferential towards business interests and costs of doing business in their countries. The excuse that we were given for 1971 was the French trying to come and get their gold. And that's probably true. And Charles de Gaulle at the time was the president of France. But here's a little something about Charles de Gaulle. Ever since World War II, the French were deeply tied to the American and the British deep state. So if somebody in London or somebody in Washington called Charles de Gaulle, and you guys, to make that connection, I'm not going to go on all into Charles de Gaulle, but he's been their call boy ever since World War II. Called Charles de Gaulle and said, look, this is what we want to do. We want you to do this to make it look like this, so that way we have a justification to do this, because British and American, perhaps West German at the time, manufacturing interests would like to do this. Because the first wave of mass manufacturing closures in the United States started happening soon after 1972, when Nixon opened relations with China. I don't think that was a coincidence. Now, with that, we had 2 oil embargoes, but during the first one, because about that time, we stopped drilling in the early 70s in the United States, and we started buying more oil from OPEC. Once the Saudis and OPEC and OPEC pulled their first oil embargo in 1973, Kissenger went and he made a deal with Saudi Arabia that we could protect Saudi Arabia and the Gulf states in exchange for trading oil in dollars. In 1973. Before 1973, oil was traded primarily in dollars, but it was also traded in pounds and in whatever local currency, right? But that pretty much guaranteed that oil was traded in dollars. So it was a loose commodity tied to a currency, but not as solid as gold. But in that agreement, that still allowed, it was kind of a quasi fiat currency. It was primarily traded in dollars, so the dollar did have something tied to it, which would be petroleum now, but not the same as gold. So we could still kind of manipulate our dollars, as could the Chinese manipulate the yuan, and the Japanese manipulate the yen, and the Mexicans manipulate the peso, and whatever, right? Y'all see what's going on here? Which, now, everybody's like, well, Trump wants to drill for oil to bring prices down for oil and everything else. That's right. That's part of it. But Trump knows that the dollar, he knows that eventually we have to get rid of our fiat currency. We have to transition from being a fiat currency back to a commodity-backed currency, a hard commodity-backed currency again. Did it ever strike anybody that other than just being energy independent, that maybe part of his strategy, the unspoken part, is for us to be the number one oil producer in the world, so that way we can transition into backing our dollar with petroleum, and not OPEC petroleum, American petroleum. In order for us to do that, we have to be the number one producer or holder of petroleum in the world. Now, here's another thing. Strategic oil reserve. All right. Not only is that something that we kind of store up because we might need it in like a severe military emergency, but think of it also when they say it's a national defense priority, that it might also have something to do with our loose affiliation with the petrodollar now. Now, inflation peaked at 9% in 2022 and 2023. What else was going on in those 2 years? What was Biden doing? He was raiding the strategic oil reserve. His justification was to flood the market to keep prices down, which initially that's true. But on the backside, since our dollar is loosely tied to oil, both in the Gulf states and here, if we don't have the oil either in the ground, in production, for sale, or in reserve to back our currency, remember we're on this petrodollar, this loose petrodollar now, what does that do? Am I making sense now? So when Trump says drill baby drill, it's not just because we get cheaper gas prices at the gas pump, or cheaper electricity prices, or cheaper whatever, right? It's more than that. So much more than that. But see, he knows that if he can lock the dollar in, and maybe later on the plan is, if like we have an Elon Musk presidency or J.D. Vance presidency following Trump, we can transition off of oil back onto gold or platinum or silver or another hard precious metal. But for now, if we can lock the dollar in via our petroleum commodities, that makes it less likely that countries like China or Mexico can manipulate their currency to draw manufacturing and production infrastructure away from this country. And therefore, it would be no longer cheaper to build things in China or build things in Mexico or Indonesia than it would be to build things in the United States, because they could no longer, well, they probably could, but not as much, manipulate their currencies against ours and make it cheaper to do business over there. And Trump is also a chess player too. These free traders are bitching about the excise taxes or the tariffs on foreign made goods. You can't do that. It's going to make things more expensive in this country. It's going to hurt the consumer. It's going to hurt business. Well, the British and the Americans, through the entirety of the 19th century, specifically after the American Civil War, were the two superpowers on the planet. Go back and read your history, okay? The British and the Americans, up until 1916, entirely funded their governments, their militaries, and everything else on tariffs. And they were the top producing manufacturing countries. They had the most powerful navies, both of them, in the world, and they traded with everybody. So that's bullshit. So you got to think in 5D chess, because Trump speaks to the lowest common denominator. But Trump is a businessman. And I read up on Trump. Yes, he's a billionaire. Okay, got it. But he's been, his great-grandfather was an engineer and a miner and a trader. His grandfather and his father were in building and in mining. Well, his grandfather was in building and mining. His father was in building. So he's been an industrialist. Or his family's been an industrialist family ever since the time of Carnegie. So he knows what works. He can look at his own lineage and see what works and what doesn't. He is, in fact, the man for the job. And that's my video for the week. This is AL-BINO. Signing out. Think deeper than the surface. Think. Y'all have a blessed day.